Hello. Welcome to the GW Books Club. This is where me and Stu take a look at some of the classic books published by Games Workshop way back in the depths of history. Normally, we cover the fiction novels published by GW Books, but we're starting to do a new series with this episode where we're going to be looking at the not quite non-fiction, but the less specifically fictional. And we're starting with Warhammer Armies: The Empire, the very first one that was published back in 1993. This is not just the first Empire Armies book, but the first ever Warhammer Armies book about a specific faction. Stu, how are you doing? You've been jumping into the Empire history recently. Did you enjoy getting back into the very first Warhammer Armies book?
Yes, loads. As you've already alluded to there, I've been very focused on Empire, more in I say recent timeline. It's not, it's a new timeline of the old world, but loads of
Yeah.
Empire stuff. Empire and Dwarves are my two big loves for Warhammer Fantasy. Though interestingly enough, or maybe not, depending on your perspective, when this came out, it wasn't something that's interested me that much. I didn't like Empire at this point of my hobby journey. I
Really?
didn't
What
dislike
just didn't
them,
appeal
but
to you?
this didn't appeal. I was all about the dwarves. I was all about elves, high elves, wood elves, that kind of thing. So Empire at this point were always, oh, okay, yeah, they're all right, but just
Boring
never
humans.
yeah, I didn't have any of the miniatures at that point. And when I came back to gaming later on, it was with Empire and Dwarves again, but then Empire. So I've spent more time loving Empire than I have been meh about them.
Well, you know
But it was
what?
very interesting going and reading this properly for the first time,
Yeah.
actually. So I've skimmed it, but it was the first time I really kind of devoured it because I didn't back in 1993 when I was 15.
Interesting that you say this, because I mean, this is not the first time I've owned the Empire Armies book, but it is the first time. My recent Marienburg project is the first time I've actually collected Empire. Because similar to yourself, I was more interested in the sort of fantasy races. So I did, orcs and goblins and undead and dark elves. That was where I did most of my collecting back in the day. There's a couple of other armies that I missed in the original eras of Warhammer Fantasy. But yeah, the Empire, because they were the sort of default or the background to the setting, I don't think I was quite as taken with them as all of the sort of more exotic armies that were out there. But it's been very fun, I think, really digging into this armies book and to just like finding out, even down to the fact that this is the very first Warhammer Armies book about just one army, and it's the
Yes.
Empire, and it's the start of this is this really important faction. We're going to really make sure the world is not built around them, but there's a huge amount of Warhammer history sort of focused on them.
Yeah.
And it feels like they pulled out all the stops to me with this book.
Yes, it's huge. There's so much in it, isn't
It
it?
felt
So
huge, right?
making notes on it and it made me realize at the time what I was probably missing. And it wasn't to do with not liking the Empire. I mean, I loved it from a fantasy role play thing. I loved the setting and the world. I think it was the miniatures. I think
Right.
at that time, the miniatures didn't inspire me. And now I look back on them and I'm very fond of a few of
Yeah.
them. But I probably prefer the miniatures more when we got to sixth and seventh edition. That's when it felt a little bit more grim and gritty
Sure.
and almost matched the Empire I had in my head from the fantasy roleplay days, where these felt a little bit too clean and a little bit too historical. And it makes sense because so many of them were sculpted by the Perrys who were doing their utmost to sculpt historical miniatures because they didn't like fantasy miniatures. And that may be why it didn't resonate so much with me as a teenager, and why I was looking to the other armies and things. But yeah, it's actually delving into this book, and I don't know. I really, really enjoyed it. Right inside that first cover, you've got some artwork, haven't you? That first half page, that's the Empire that excites me. But maybe the painted armies, as gorgeous as they are, just felt a little bit too clean and pristine at the time, which was very much the painting style at the time. It was getting into that red era, weren't we? At that period, and I think that's probably why I wasn't excited at the time. But the actual book itself is great.
Yeah, I think that's a really good shout, actually, because that historical bent of the Empire Army at this time, this is where they introduce a lot of more fantastic elements. The earlier Empire Army, which itself wasn't very old. It only really came into being with the third edition properly. But here, they're kind of moving towards fantastic, the war wagon and the steam tank and some of that stuff. But it is still really grounded in historical stuff. And yeah, I think that that's a fair shout. As a boy, it was just kind of less appealing to me personally to sort of see that kind of stuff. But like you say, the book as almost an artifact, certainly looking back on it now, but even at the time, I think it it's an incredible sort of work of fantasy world building, I suppose. I mean,
Yeah.
it benefits because they're drawing on loads of already published material, whether that's from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which really delved into the Empire and did a lot of hard work. But then all of this stuff was already published, or most of this stuff was already published in White Dwarf as well.
Yes.
So they've been through iterations of putting it together. One interesting thing I think, we often talk generally in the community about the lack of credits for various Games Workshop books. And I absolutely think everyone should be credited on their work. This Empire Armies book doesn't have a specific author.
Yeah.
There's no credit for who wrote this book, and I think part of that is because it is assembling so much material from other authors. The articles in White Dwarf, they list Nigel Stillman, they list Rick Priestley. We
Yeah.
know a lot of the guys who worked on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay have written some of the material in here as well, or the first version of material in here. So Jim Bambra, Phil Gallagher, Graham
Yeah.
Davis, and others. There's it's interesting that there's obviously so much of the studio have gone into creating this. And I think that sort of shows through in the quality of it. There was also, whilst we're on credits, a very interesting note that the game design consultant for this book was Brian Ansell. And of course, this is published in 1993. So Brian Ansell's left the company. The management buyout happened in 1991. He sold Games Workshop.
Yeah.
It now is owned by the management team and Tom Kirby. So, but he was still involved somehow at some level with this book, whether or not that was because he was involved in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. I don't know. But all of that together kind of gives there's a real richness to just how many hands and how many ideas have been poured into the creation of this really interesting sort of corner of the old world, I think.
Yeah, I'm really thought about when I flicked to the inside cover, I expected to see by Rick Priestley.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, that's interesting. But you were totally right. It is White Dwarf articles completely taken from White Dwarf. And I quite like that. I quite like that all kind of organic way of building the book. But you're probably right about that Brian must have had something to do with it, or at least it's been a long process of developing this. And this feels like it's got still got a few toes in third edition fantasy, even though this is well into, comfortably into fourth edition. Because we had the Get You By Army List book that came in the box, didn't we? We've had. Was this after? This was after the Battle Magic supplement, I'm assuming, isn't it? I think this came after the extra supplements.
That's a good question, actually. I'm not certain.
I'm just looking.
When was Battle Magic?
92, I think.
Right. Then, so yeah, you're right.
I think it was 92. So I got a feeling this was after those. So this is kind of like there's a bit of Oldhammer in here, but we're comfortably moving into the new management and middle hammery period of it, and it feels like there's a healthy mix of the two kind of feels going on in there. But yeah, I think you're right about the Ansel thing. That must be what it is. They've probably been developing this for a few years.
Think so, right?
Yeah, it's good.
I do think one way in which I think you can see the fingerprint of stuff like Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay on this book in particular is like how much time they spend talking about rivers in the old world and just across the Empire. Now, obviously, that is super important, and it adds a lot of detail, and it makes the world seem way more immersive. And it's like, that's great. That sort of information really lends itself to role playing and exploring that corner of the world. You don't need to know every tributary and every river in order to fight battles in the Empire or use the Empire's army. So I just found that quite interesting that choice was made.
It's really odd, isn't it? If you look at the contents page, and I actually made a note on this because it's really boring, but also stood out to me, is you got your normal contents entries with your page number, but then in smaller text underneath, you've got more stuff that's included in many ways just on that page. You mean, well, surely when you get to that page, you're going to see. But
Yeah.
we use rivers as the example, and you get to the bit that says so the rivers, it's page 13, and then it's got Sol, Upper Reich, Ava, Stir, Talabek, Reich, and you're like, well, okay, why is that
Yeah,
mentioned?
there's so much detail.
It's almost like you've indexed your own contents
Yeah.
entry. And it's bizarre. And when you get to experiment, later on the war wagon page, and then you got experimental engineer hand weapons, and there's loads of stuff. Why is the Hochland long rifle, repeater handgun, the blunderbuss, the man catcher, the hook, halberd, ball, and chain all listed there? They're just the
I can
weapons for the
only
crew of the war
assume
wagon. Why is it in the contents?
because it must have been because
It's
they knew
weird.
there would be some big fans who are going to open this book and they're going to look through that contents page and immediately need to know where the Sol information is,
Yeah.
or they just want to flip straight through to
Yeah.
the halberd. That's the only thing they're interested in.
It's a bit bizarre. It's almost like someone was tasked with producing an index for it, and then they started to do it, and they go, "No, we're not having an index." Oh,
Maybe it
oh, we'll
was.
put it in the
It could have been
contents.
something like that. Yeah, yeah, because there is no index at the back.
It's a
Yeah,
bit weird.
but yes, there is
No,
a real.
that's
Well, it's a huge wealth of
it's a
information.
huge contents. Those
It
two-page
is.
contents,
Yeah, it is mega, and
very
there's
detailed.
loads of stuff in here, and actually, it's really super interesting. I think because, like you said before, this book feels really big. It feels stuffed full of information, stuffed full of detail, really rich world building, and then obviously
Mm.
loads of great stuff about rules and the army lists and all of the stuff you can field. It's not actually much bigger or much smaller. Well, I mean, it gets smaller than some of the later armies books, but sixth edition was 80 pages. This edition, in terms of content, was only 81. So
Yeah,
it's basically
it's
the
normal
same.
sized. Yeah, it
Yeah,
just feels packed.
it just
Maybe it's because you just list everything in the contents. It feels
well,
like it's
yeah,
just
you're reading
something.
the name of the rivers 20 times over the
Yeah.
course of the book. But yeah, it feels like there's way more in it. I mean, later on, seventh and eighth editions get into the 90s, like 96, 97 pages.
Yeah.
What I find interesting about that, and we won't get too far into those books, but they feel a lot lighter in terms of content
Hmm.
than this. And it could, I guess, be because the pages themselves just have more text on. There
I
is
think
amazing
that's
art in this book and lots of really, really good art throughout. But there's also some pages that are just not dense, is not the right word, but they're just full of text and
yeah.
information. There's loads to learn about the Empire by reading this book.
It's very well paragraphed, and
Mm.
then there's headings for lots of paragraphs as well. It's almost again like we're talking about the content. So this should be the review of the content. So it feels like the content, surprisingly enough, really reflects the contents. The way it's displayed is that kind of level of detail, whereas maybe a lot of the information might be surrounded by flavor text in
Mm.
later army books.
Yeah, so I think given that there's so much information here, and they actually managed to ground it in a really like it's written in quite a realistic way. I mean, obviously there's lots of great history and there's all that sort of stuff, but I was quite taken with the fact that they have a political map and a geographic
Yes.
map. They actually separate those two concepts, put them separate, so you can see okay, and there's also like the inset map of the known world, so you can see where the empire sits within that, all of that sort of stuff, and then the politics, which they talk about a lot of that sort of stuff, how the empire actually functions and works. All
Yes.
of that is really interesting because it kind of, you look on the back of the book, it's like the empire is the largest and the mightiest realm of men in the old world. It kind of paints this picture of something that is just this united, very strong, noble sort of honor bound culture and nation. And then when you actually start to get into the detail, it's so much more complicated. There's
Hmm.
from the outside, I mean, it's like when you're saying about the sort of the cleanness of the knights and the army, the historical looking like nature of those miniatures. From the outside, it does all look like these gleaming knights and just a very kind of plain, almost vanilla sort of medieval army at one point. But then the deeper you get into it, there's so much more nuance and complexity behind how the empire works, how it functions, that adds a huge amount. Stuff that you don't even need for the actual tabletop, for the battle game. Like what elector counts and how they elect the emperor and all of the different politics and agendas that are happening within the political elements of the empire. The fact that it's not even, it's not quite an empire really. It's a collection of different united loosely city states and provinces. All of that stuff is awesome, and so much of that comes from the role playing game, of course. But
Yeah.
it's great that they completely commit to it in this book because it just sets the stage for the Empire to be more than just the good guys or the sort of generic humans of this fantasy setting. It makes them into quite an interesting place to tell stories and to fight battles, I think.
Yeah, you're totally right. And they make a big play of really kind of setting in stone this is what it is, and making it very clear.
Mm.
And by doing the political map, by having a table with the list of elector counts and the provinces and all of it makes it very easy to kind of look at and see. And that does feel like a hangover, not a bad one. So maybe hangover is a bad word for it because hangovers aren't usually good, but it feels like it's drawn from their experiences in writing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, whereas with later army books, that stuff was within a body of text more. And they'll talk more in a flavorful kind of more long-winded way of saying, just like I'm taking a long-winded way of saying this, talking about the different elector counts and mentioning them. They won't necessarily put them in a list.
Sure.
I actually like this because this is easy for me to understand and get my head around rather than reading long pages worth of text with names of certain people in it. I find it much easier to look at this, and that's really good. And it almost feels like this kind of first edition of the Empire books. You almost need this 101 edition to help you understand the later ones. And if you come along an 8th edition and have the book there, yes, that information is all there, and much of it is the same information, but it's almost presented in a much simpler way here.
Yeah,
I really liked it. Looking at it, I think this is a really, if I was someone that I don't know Warhammer, and even someone who wants to understand later editions, this is almost an easier way for people to read and get their head around it because it's so nicely paragraphed. It's so nicely. It's easier to pick up and read a little bit and just read a couple of pages than it is some of the other books as well. But it's just so well done.
it is really well done. Yeah, and I think that's a very good point actually, just about how we know that for 4th edition Warhammer they were trying to make things more accessible. They were courting a younger audience, new people to the hobby and to the game. So actually, there's no room for kind of received wisdom. You can't just say, well, everyone knows what the Empire is, because it didn't exist properly yet. It hadn't had that much detail. And unless you'd been playing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, you didn't know all of this stuff. So packaging it up in a really accessible way here builds the foundation, like you say, for future generations of Empire players and for different editions. You're not going to have to cover the same information in as much detail because it's not going to be, you've done it now. You've kind of built that foundation here. And you mentioned before just about that sort of early piece of art that was in the front. Amazing piece, by Fangorn, who it was also used, I think, on the cover for Beasts in Velvet. So one of the GW books has that piece of art, and it is a fantastic bit of art that does really depict, the Empire in a sort of chaotic moment. What did you think about the other art that was scattered throughout this book?
It's just of its time, really. I find it really charming, but I wouldn't always. I don't know. It's a real mix of artists, isn't there? As well, there's. I think there's just fun stuff all the time. Even though there's loads of text, there's loads of these smaller pencil drawings or pen and ink drawings throughout. I'm looking at it now, and there's picture of a Kislev horse archer, and I don't know. I just like the overall feel of it. I quite like the black and white nature of some of these older books, actually.
Yeah, I do. There's loads of really nice, characterful John Blanche pieces, for instance, in here as well. There's like full color pages. Full page spreads by John Blanche, which are some loads of character, loads of interesting story within it. But then there's lots of just tiny little illustrations, illustrations by Blanche
going between paragraphs and things.
Yeah, which are great. And then one particular image I really like, as well as some amazing knights and stuff like that in here. But there is a halfling archer by John Blanche that I think is just really, really cool. It really sells that.
It's a halfling. It's got to be cool. They're always cool.
Yeah. But yeah, just there's so much cool art here, and yes, there is a sort of nostalgia to it, and sort of looking back on that, and this was the era where most of the army's books were in black and white, and you'd have a couple of color pages. There was obviously like a great showcase of heavy metal work in here, but the majority of the book is black and white, and they
Mhm.
really, I think, managed to get the most out of that. Like, there's
Yes.
still so much depth to these images, even though they're not in color.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's stuff that's clearly from fantasy role play as well. They've
Mm,
definitely mined all of their artwork for a number of years, along with some newer parts that look like they're done specifically for this. They may not have been, especially in the stories, but nothing feels out of place. There's
yeah.
a real nice mix of styles, but they do seem to work. Maybe it's because they're all done in black and white that they all work together as a
Yeah, it
single
gives it a
presentation.
cohesive feel, right?
Yeah, but
Yeah. What did you think of the actual army itself then? So obviously, there's loads of background, loads of history here as well. But then there's a huge chunk about how the army works, like literally mechanically, how does
yeah,
these war machines work? How do some of these new characters and new rules work? And then the army list as well. But yeah,
yeah.
what are your thoughts about this relatively early Empire army?
It's huge, isn't it? Which is
Yes.
it's a good thing. It's huge, and it's there's stuff in it that disappeared for a long time. So we've got Kislev units in there,
Yep.
horse archers. We've got foot archers, some infantry. We've got Tsarina Katerina later on at the
Yeah.
back, which
Yeah.
has got her own spell cards in there as
Yeah,
well.
she
So
does. Yeah.
you almost theme your army around Kislev at the time when it was all part of the Empire. We've got halflings and
Mhm.
dwarves and ogres, which and now reappearing in that, which I'm extremely excited about. So yeah, they're all great things as well. So I love all of that. It's very much the the Warhammer Empire I love.
Yeah.
It screams to me, and I won't go on a tangent about current painting projects and things, but it screams to me Nuln. It screams to me the different quarters and this really multicultural
Yeah.
center
Yeah.
that the Empire is. And I love that theme, if you want it to be, is there for you in the army. And even the knightly orders, which again we now see with the release of the Old World and the new army book, there's different rules for different knightly orders in there,
Mhm.
and that's coming back now. And those things, I saw a little bit of it in sixth edition, but they pretty much disappeared. We obviously Rights Guard knights remained,
Yeah.
but everything else started to sort of slip away. So yeah, I love it. It's right back to the stuff that we missed for a while. So I love that it's a huge, but it is huge,
Yeah.
and there's lots of information. You get the talking about the different units and a little bit of history around them, and then you get the army list afterwards with the rules as well. There's a lot to really dig into from a lore perspective of the army list as well as the rules.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm on exactly the same page because this is the army I think about when I think about an Empire army because I
Yeah.
love that kind of diversity of different sizes and shapes of units. Like, and in terms of literally, you can have halflings and dwarves and humans and then ogres. That is ace, I think. That just is it makes for me the visual sort of profile of the army is really interesting. There's so many choices. Yeah, maybe too many choices. Maybe you don't quite need that many different options for your knights and maybe that many different types of infantry. But it's there's so many things you can do with this army and so many
Mhm.
ways you can theme it. You can build it around a particular play style, a particular just a color scheme that you want to do, a particular type of unit that you're a big fan of. Like you say, you can do a Kislev themed army if you want to. So you can really create all of these different versions of the Empire army from the same
Mhm.
building blocks. And I think it is a shame that the later editions they did shed, I feel, a lot of that, what made the Empire army so good and what played into the Empire army's lore and background.
Yeah.
They as you sort of reduced the number of options and they obviously they introduced a few new things here and there over the years, but it did lose that kind of, like you say, multiculturalism and the different
Yes.
the different things you could do with the army. I think the Empire were always they always offered lots of different play styles and strategies,
Yes.
but I do think you probably never had as many as you did with this army. Like this
No.
fourth edition army is the one where you could do pretty much anything, turn it to anything. You could really super lean into magic, or you could super lean into the technology and the sort of steampunky kind of aesthetic. You could do
Yeah.
knights if you really wanted to. Lots of different ways to play and build and collect an Empire army, which is great, I think.
It's a huge sandbox.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that's why that number of units are there. You clearly can't fit them all into one army unless you're playing a ginormous
Yes.
game. But it does give the ability to really theme your army, whether you want to theme it around a particular knightly order or lots of knights coming together, or a particular type of a known style list with your halflings and your ogres and your dwarves all there defending, representing their quarters of the city, defending the city, or whether it's much more of a, I don't know, a Hochland style army where there's a lot more troops on it. You can do that. And yes, I didn't realize how much I missed that. And I suppose until now, and yeah, spoilers, that's all back with the latest edition and what's going on and I'm doing at the moment. So it resonates quite nicely, actually, reading those things. And maybe that's what made it stand out a little bit more, because it's kind of in lining up with what I'm doing with my own hobby now. Maybe what I should have realized back when I was 15 and this book came out, actually, that I would have loved it and didn't look into it in the same way. But
Take it for granted,
brilliant.
right? You take for granted that that war wagons would be around forever.
Forever.
And like you say, they're coming back, which is great. But this was where they were introduced, and they'd be lost after this in the traditional Warhammer game. There's loads of stuff in here that was just gone after this.
Well,
or some
halflings.
stuff that sort of halflings just being an option,
and they haven't come back. That's
which is a real shame, right? And loads of fun stuff in here. What intrigues me, actually, just so obviously this book's coming out in '93. The game came out in '83, so it's 10 years in, about a third of the life of Warhammer. This is where you get loads of new special characters who are introduced into the world and to the story. Most of them do stick around until the end of the game, and they, it's here where we get loads of interesting, fun characters. Obviously, you get Karl Franz had been around in the role playing game and stuff like that, but you're getting lots of really fun special characters who, again, there's just a huge number of them. There's so many.
It really is.
It's just I can't imagine everyone would like. Most of these special characters surely were never actually played because there's just so many here. I mean, I like Volkmar, the Grim, the Grand Theogenist, and on his ridiculous war altar, his war altar. But then you've got your Marius, Leitdorf, and lots of other guys like that. Just so many options for just I want a special character general who's not that different from a load of other special characters, like in terms of character. But there's just multiple options for you.
Yeah, I think it's 11 special characters. So a quick count up.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge number.
It's crazy, isn't it? You're moving on to later editions. You're moving on to 4, maybe.
Yeah, well, 6th edition.
And now we're on Sword 2. Yeah. It's crazy. Yeah. But yeah, you got Karl Franz, Magnus the Pious, Ludwig Schwarzhelm, the Grand Theogonist, and we got Supreme Patriarch of the Colleges of Magic. Nice, snappy name there. Kurt Helborg, Boris Todbringer. So you got your some of your named elect accounts, obviously not all of them. Yeah. That would have been even wilder if they did the one.
Yeah, just gone for the lot. Yeah.
Aldebrand Ludenhoff, Valimar von Rakoff, Marius Leitdorf, and then you got Tsarina Katerina as well. So yeah, crazy amount in there, and that's never to be repeated again.
Yeah, but those characters would stay in the lore. I think almost all of them survive until the end times, more or less.
Yeah.
Because they not all of them actually, but most of them do, and they are about in the story doing stuff just in the background in the lore, and that's fun. I think
it's brilliant. It's brilliant. I'm glad. I suppose some of these would have been the first time they were mentioned. I mean, you were more familiar with fantasy role play than I was. So I played a bit, but I didn't devour the books the same way as you have. But much of this was setting yes, it may have been over White Dwarfs, I suppose, a lot of it as well, but very much cementing and setting the scene for what will become the Empire up until now mostly unchanged in many ways, rewritten
Many
here, the
ways.
odd little
Yeah.
date changed there and here and there because it didn't match up or there's a bit of a conflict in it. But yeah, it's kind of, this is it. This is the birth really of the Empire Army
Yeah.
as we know it, and it's just been refined
I
since
think
then.
that's right. Yeah. Yeah, and refined and as I say, some stuff was lost and sort of changed and tweaked and removed over time. I think the options kind of, because they focused further and further in on the man in the empire of man as it has become, that there was definitely a shedding of some of that kind of that fantasy stuff in one sense, because you did
Hmm.
get rid of your halflings and your ogres and dwarves and stuff, which I think is, for me, it is a shame because I think that adds so much. They did add fantasy in other ways because ultimately by eighth edition you're going to get demigryph knights and this kind of other type of fantasy, more steampunk kind of stuff, more.
Yeah.
I think I don't know if aetherpunk is what people call it, but this sort of magical steampunk stuff with like your
Yes.
Luminarch of Haish and stuff like that. So there is a lot of that stuff still in there, and it does. The Empire kind of gets not in a literal sense, but maybe it gets bigger in one sense. I don't know if that's the right term I'm looking for, but
Yeah, I know.
the sort of the nature of it kind of
The total unit entries, they could probably get a little bit smaller to start with, but then yes, they definitely
I mean,
increase
they
again
get
with more
bigger in
specialist
literal
type.
size, yeah, unit size, and then also miniature size as well. Like stuff just gets
Yeah.
bigger over time. I mean, that was just how the game evolved and changed, right? You take a look at the first ever Karl Franz miniature by Marauder, which as these things were on a 40 millimeter monster base. By the time you get to the end, the end times, and you've got the Karl Franz on Deathclaw is just massive miniature, beautiful miniature, really impressive centerpiece. But like, it's just that's
It's
real big.
massive.
Yeah.
It is massive. And I think, I suppose over time, all they've really done is making sure that these identities for different races have their own factions. They probably didn't want to have a slightly different version of dwarves, and then the reimagining of ogres in the future
Sure.
again gave them a very different look and
It did.
feel. I think where you've written, they've all got new versions of themselves, so to speak. The dwarves developed a bit more. These halflings that I suppose really lost out.
Yeah, they
They
did. They
kind of
did.
disappeared from the game, and
Well, the
yeah,
banner of lumping troops was keeping them alive for a long time.
yeah,
You
only
know?
still is. Lumping group banners on the old world interactive map.
Well, there you
So
go. So yeah, but he's
even if they
back,
haven't come back yet, I
or at
still
least
think
his
they'll be
ancestors
back.
are around, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
But the story that's in there about the hot pot's really fun, isn't it? I
Yeah,
think.
yes, yeah. We've not talked about the stories. Yeah, so there's a few snippets of fiction which I don't know if they were all written by William King, but I believe some were.
Mm,
And there is one about the creation of the halfling hotpot, arguably the best weapon of war in
yes,
Warhammer history. But yeah, what did you think about that story?
it's just good fun, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's of that era of when they just had loads of fun making up stuff because
yeah,
that's what it is. It's silly, really, but
very
I,
silly.
I didn't. I loved that as a teenager. That silliness was just brilliant. The mildly funny stuff was extremely funny for a
Hmm.
14 or 15-year-old. So I loved it. I've always loved the halflings anyway. I love that miniature as well. So that all elements
Yeah.
of that halfling hot pot thing is me. I love it. So I'm probably not looking at it very objectively
Yeah,
because
no,
it's
I mean
just
thinking
good
about the
fun.
sense of humor of that story as well, and just like the secret ingredients and the fact that it's just a boiling hot pot that will melt people alive. There's maybe a hint of Rick Priestley about that, so that could be his.
Yes,
It could be his writing. But
I
there is
think so.
almost certainly a William King story is the Gotrek and Felix
Mm,
appearance, right? So
it
yeah, I mean,
is,
what
yeah.
you're a massive Gotrek and Felix fan. I'm an increasingly growing fan of Gotrek and Felix as I read more and experience more. What was it like sort of dipping into an early snippet of their
So I
adventure?
forgot it was in there. And I started reading. I was like, "Oh, brilliant!" And it's. I remembered I have obviously I've read it before. It's called Death and Glory, isn't it?
Right, right.
And I think it was later titled Death and Glory.
Yes, I don't think it
I
had a
don't know
name
where
in
it
the
was
book.
republished.
Yeah.
But it's fine, isn't it? It's perfect Gotrek and Felix story because
Mm.
it's our heroes on the edge of battle at the start of a battle. So it makes sense. The theme of the battle being in an Empire
Mm.
book, telling you all about the Empire army and how it's lining up and the different actions, and Gotrek being Gotrek and wanting to fight his doom, and Felix not really wanting to be involved in a battle and trying to find a way out of it. And it's great, it's charming, it's fun, but it does its job well in the story, which is to
Mm.
kind of introduce the feeling of an Empire army massing for battle.
Yeah.
Doesn't
Yeah.
need to do any more than
It's a
that, I
cute
suppose,
story,
does it?
right?
Yeah,
Yeah, it's a fun,
yeah.
fun little. I mean, I believe, and we don't have to get into the specifics of this because I don't know how this actually ultimately ends. But I believe there's a bit of a contradiction here as well in terms of one particular character's fate,
Ah,
because we find one of the characters who's introduced in this story. I think it's the first ever appearance of Snorri,
yeah.
and in this story, spoilers everyone for a '93 book, he dies in this tale. If he gets crushed by a troll. Now, I've not seen all of or read all of Snorri's adventures yet, but I have
Yes,
experienced him in Demon Slayer, and
yes,
it feels like quite an unfair way for him to go out based on his contributions in that story. So I think there
yes.
may have been some retconning from King at
Yes,
some
he
point,
definitely
right?
lives on. I think he
Right.
lives on into Age of Sigmar.
Right.
So
Okay.
I think I've not read any of those. I've not read all of those, and the ones I have read, I've only ever read once.
Hmm.
And they're fine as well. Before anyone wants to jump on and give them a kick, not as they're not my. I don't enjoy them as much as the earlier stuff, but they're not bad stories.
Hmm.
Yeah, so yeah, that's definite
Hmm.
retcon, isn't it? I think there's that with a few of them, aren't they? When they've gone back, and even when they've made them omnibuses, they've gone back and had to change the odd date here or there just to make sure that it fits with things, which is fine. That's just
I think if
readjusting and
anything,
reorganizing things for them to make sense.
yeah, maybe it adds to the sort of, these are kind of like fireside tales that people might tell about the stuff
Yeah.
that Gotrek and Felix have been up to, or half remembered story they heard in a tavern from Felix as they were passing through, and that kind of stuff.
Well, I mean, spoilers again. Felix's brother publishes a lot of
Right.
Felix's
Yes, I've heard
stories
about this. Yeah.
without him knowing, without his permission.
Right.
And that's deliberately placed in those stories to just to explain any little
So you can get,
inconsistencies.
yeah, I mean, that's a nice way
Um,
of doing it, isn't it? Because then you can, this is as canon as you want it or need it to be. It
yes,
doesn't ruffle any feathers.
I think one of the early Nathan Long books, Elf Slayer, Felix actually starts to read one of these books to find out whether his brother has changed too much.
That's fun.
So again, it's clever. So that could quite easily be a case of Felix misremembering, or they've changed
Right.
it and Snorri didn't die, or whatever. It doesn't really matter, I suppose. But it definitely does what it needs to do in this book.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, looking back on it overall, do you think that this is an Empire Army? Could you imagine ever playing this Empire Army again?
Yes, now,
Yeah.
absolutely. As I say, you would fit very. There's just to the right of me there is the army I'm building for the Throne of Skulls at the end of February, based on the book I waved around earlier on, which I can wave around now because we're past the NDA date on those. But I've been working. It's perfect. It's suffering from the same problems of not being able to squeeze everything in that you want to. We talked about, is there too much in the army list? It's just if you're going to play a certain points level, you can't squeeze everything in. But yes, because I want halflings in my theme. It's a known theme. I want ogres in there. I want imperial dwarves. I love all those miniatures, and I love that theme of the multicultural city, and that's what I'm working on right now. So the answer is yes, absolutely, because I'm actually doing it right now.
Yeah.
And I couldn't have built that army list with the sixth, the seventh, or the eighth edition
Yeah.
sets of the army book rules.
Yeah. Yeah. It remains great for that, I think. I can definitely see myself playing a fourth edition like army again, and a game of Warhammer
Mhm.
generally. I've got a
Yeah,
lot of fondness for it. It's where I was first getting started on Warhammer games, and it's such a blast from the past, and is great. I think that it lives up to that. It's still fun. It's still got such a richness and there's a quality to it. It's worth going back and spending some time with, even if I've maybe not paid quite as much attention to some of the specific rules about how the steam tank works, for instance, because I'm not going to be playing it anytime soon. But just spending time in this era of Warhammer Fantasy again, it's has been really nice, I think. And and that comes through in the art, that comes through in the heavy metal sections, that comes through in the actual writing itself. Even just looking at this Dave Gallagher cover,
Yeah,
it's just awesome. It's so
it
good.
is great.
It's fantastic. It's really, really, really fun.
It's an amazing picture. Everything in here is in many ways just what the Empire is now, but it's got that real kind of 90s filter to
Yeah.
it, and that sort of origin story almost of it. So it's you can produce an army from this book that would very much fit now. But also there's so many things that are a little bit quirky and different that you wouldn't see now, and you can see how it's changed, but also how little has changed.
Sure. Yeah. I
Really,
mean, there's
I
a
mean,
fair
it's
argument. There's
a lot
so
of
much.
years.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Don't remind me, but yeah, it's a lot of years. But it's very recognizable. But there's some charm to it that you wouldn't find now in the way the writing is. It's a little bit more serious now.
Yeah. Yeah, which I guess is, like you say, the sort of grimmer, darker kind of era that came in with sixth edition in particular, and then they kind of played around with that for seventh and eighth. There wasn't quite that sort of earnest. It's not. I mean, silliness is not quite the right word, but like there is I mean, even that the halfling hot pot is absurd.
Yeah.
It's an absurd joke, but it works, I think, in this kind of
Yes.
you know, again, I don't want to use the word silly because that's not quite what I mean, but there is just an absurdity to this version of the Warhammer world where you can, in the same book, talk about this sort of complex political, the nature of the empire as this unstable, difficult place where, all of this sort of back and forth and the different agendas. That's like really nuanced and sophisticated. And then at the same time, there's just halflings throwing soup
Yeah,
onto
there's something
goblins.
quite Blood Bowl-esque around it, isn't there?
Yeah, I
About the
suppose
Blood
there
Bowl
is
history,
that.
and it didn't completely disappear. And I'm really fond of all the different areas because for me, Warhammer is all those things. I really love
Yes.
the dark grimness of sixth edition, but I
Hmm.
also really love this. For me, it can be all of those things depending on what mood I'm in or what
Hmm.
I quite like. You've got serious moments in Gotrek and Felix, but you've also got loads of comedic relief. But you definitely saw a bit of a change away in sixth and seventh and eighth edition from a lot of the humorous stuff. There's always been bits of it, especially with the magical items
Hmm.
and things like that. And a lot of that's back. I mean, there's a magical item called Squints Often's Mystical Magnifier or something like that in the New Arcane Journal. Somebody squints often. It's great, and that's clearly would have fitted in this book. So it's
Hmm.
nice to see that kind of coming back, but that kind of joke feels like it originated here. This
Yeah.
was the era of that kind of. We're going to have some fun writing those things. Maybe more than the fantasy role play. There's this more punish kind of silliness.
There's a lot of puns in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and even predating this, going way back into the earlier editions of Warhammer, and I think that's just the way that Richard Halliwell and Rick Priestley wrote. It was their sense of
Mm,
humor, right?
yeah,
But yeah,
yeah,
I think it reaches this kind of perfect pitch here in this
yeah,
edition, and then does go in a different direction. And not to say there isn't any humor in the later editions, but it is kind of colored by that grim
yeah.
darkness and the kind of
Well, it's
more
kept for
serious
certain
tone.
races, isn't it? It's almost like the
Yeah, they
humor's
also, yeah,
piled
you're
on
right.
to the orcs and goblins a little bit
Yes.
more than.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think I agree with your general point there though, that actually that there are elements of every edition that speak to me in different ways at different times that matter, and the great thing being that you can literally pick up any edition and play any edition at any
Yeah,
time now, including the old world, which is like you say, delving back into some of this stuff and bringing it back and allowing us to play it again with new stuff, which is great. But yeah, just because this was a fantastic moment in the Empire's history doesn't mean that it's you shouldn't ever want to play an eighth edition army and
Yeah.
get your Marienburg landship, which is equally absurd in a different way, and put that
Yes.
on the table. So there's always these different potential moments to enjoy this kind of stuff. Yeah, I guess I kind of would love, and maybe the old world was the opportunity, and or maybe not, I don't know. But like, I kind of want everything from every army book to have
Yes.
rules at the same time so that I can just use it all in one different, in like just one edition. So I can have a
Yes.
Marienburg class landship and some Demigryph knights and some halflings, and whatever else I want to take from any other edition, just put them all in one place.
Yeah, it clearly all works.
Yeah,
For me, it all fits.
it
It's
does.
just
Yeah, I
the
think it
angle
does.
you're telling the story from.
Mm.
Yeah,
Mm.
maybe one day. To be honest, I think they'd all be around now. I think like anything, it's to do with commerciality of model
Exactly. Yeah,
availability.
I think that's probably
And
true.
that
And
land ship has
ban
gone, I'm
rules and
afraid. You're very lucky to have the one you've got because I don't think it's coming back ever.
yeah, which is a real shame because it's a really fun piece of kit, and it definitely feels like it would fit into this version of the Empire Army as well. And there's other
Oh
stuff
yeah,
that came later.
I think if the model was still castable, then
Yeah,
it would have come. It
yeah,
would be there. But who knows in the future? We might get a new one, a plastic one or something.
indeed. Yeah, I mean that would be great fun. But yeah, there's lots of fun stuff from the later editions. But I do think this marks because especially given that this was the first Warhammer Armies book. Obviously, they'd done the collected Warhammer Armies for third edition that covered every army that was around. This was the first one for a faction, and like we were saying at the start, it feels like they really put a lot into this to kind of create the format and to say this is how we're going to do it going forward. And obviously, you'd see that a version of that in the 40k Codex books, but for Warhammer, this became the staple. We're going to
Yeah,
do rich history. We're going to do timelines. We're going to do special characters, army lists, special rules, all of this sort of stuff laid out in this way. I'm very excited actually to go back through other sort of contemporary armies books and see how much they lived up to the potential of this. Because, like we say, there's loads of Warhammer Fantasy roleplay material, there's loads of other material about the Empire to bring into this. For some of the other armies, there just wasn't as much. You think
hmm,
about, say, a Wood Elves or a Lizard Men, they were drawing on, sure, there is history to bring into it, but they've modified it and changed them so much. There's just
yeah,
not going to be as much material off the shelf to repurpose for an armies book. Did they get a chance? Obviously, I remember flicking through those books or reading those books at the time. It's been a long time since I've read them, so I'm excited to go back and check out some of that stuff as well and see if it lives up to this one.
yeah. I think you're right. And I do wonder now that whether, as much as there's some unit entries missing throughout the later editions, whether the core of the lore and the makeup of the empire
Mm.
is the most stable and consistent thing compared to some of the others who were less developed, obviously needed to develop over time, and the lore of those other factions have had to develop over time and change, and it'll be interesting to see actually
Yeah,
what
well, I
those
mean,
early ones are like, because I definitely haven't read all of those fourth edition army books.
sure. Yeah, and based on videos I've done in my Building Warhammer Army series, there is some way you can see that iterative approach. I think the Empire is one where it took them a while to get to it. It wasn't one of the first armies created for Warhammer, but when they did create it, because they'd done
Mm,
all that work on fantasy roleplay in particular, when they created it for the tabletop, this was pretty much it. They got it in. I mean,
yeah,
it's not quite getting it in one, but they had it, and then they didn't need to change it and evolve it too much. Other armies have really shifted and changed, sort of ebbed and flowed as they've found them and found what makes them a Warhammer army. I mean, you mentioned ogres and that sort of the way things develop in that sense. There was for some armies, I think there has been a real sort of focusing in and drilling in on very specific elements, and it's actually a sort of a journey, I think, that happens through all of Warhammer and Age of Sigmar as well, where things get they sort of work out what's this army about. We're starting from this big thing and we've got loads of options here. okay, we're drilling down. It's actually just about the men and the knights and the foot troops. So let's get rid of some of this other stuff. And then we think it's going to be about the steampunkiness of it. So we're going to do that. And you really focus in and focus in and focus in. And then when they obviously went to Age of Sigmar, they had a chance to, do leapfrog a load of different iterative steps to make things even more specific. And that's almost where you get to a Cities of Sigmar, which is
Yeah,
very much into the, it's very, very specifically into the kind of steampunky infantry and cavalry of the Empire Army. It's just along the same journey, but it's much, much further into the future.
yeah, yeah,
And I
yeah,
think you see
yeah.
that across the board. It's dead interesting kind of like development cycle. Yeah. So and some armies didn't do that in quite the same way. So yeah, interesting stories. Some of it told through these very books. So I think there's definitely some fun to be had revisiting some of them.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah,
Looking forward
yeah,
to it.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think any other thoughts on Warhammer Armies, the Empire?
No, I mean, I think we've done a pretty good. I mean, the final thing I'll say is that the only army list you could have all 8 steam tanks. It's wild in your army list. I mean, there's no limit on the steam tanks. You could have 8 steam tanks if you want. Obviously, there were some percentages involved in that, but the 0 to 8 steam tanks is the army list entry. Can you imagine that?
What a wild one. I mean, and I can't remember. I've already must have forgotten because they made, I'm sure it alludes to them making 12, right? But some of them broken down, some of them destroyed.
I think so. Yeah, it's my head's in the middle ages of the old
And
world
this
at the
is where
moment,
this is the danger,
where there's
right?
more of them again.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
yes,
But yeah, I think they were created 12 and then
yeah,
they lost some of them, weren't able to repair some of them. And then if memory serves, in one of the later editions, I can't remember if it's sixth or even later. I think it might be sixth, where they actually
six. Yeah,
introduced the distinction between the different steam tanks, between those sort of 8 available
there was
steam tanks.
quite a few articles in White Dwarf.
Right, yeah, because that's where
I
you get
found them
your,
recently for a video I made.
of course,
And you started, and they did it more than once when they explored the lore of them. And then there was they brought out the plastic miniatures, so that was obviously refocusing on it. And then there was the upgrade kits, weren't they, for the different
amazing
types.
kits. Yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah, they
really good.
definitely explored that more around that era, I think, sort of before you got into seventh edition, when everything got a bit more kind of, no, there's your plastic one, and you
And
can
that's the
have one in
fun.
your army, yeah.
Yeah,
But yeah, it was definitely explored more. But back then, it was, yeah, I think there was 8. You could 8 serviceable ones, and you could have 8 if you. There was still 200 points, so you'd
yes,
have to be
quite
playing a
pricey and
pretty.
not cheap kits either, right? Because and they
No,
were they were solid metal, tough
they
builds.
were, they're quite small as well. But yeah, they were.
Yes, they were. Yeah, I mean that just reminds me on the War Wagon, and I'm glad it's sort of been re-engineered for its re-release. But that's very tough to get those kind of those construction that those kits just didn't want to stay together. The flat
No,
metal
I can
panels,
imagine. I
so
can
heavy.
imagine you weren't really. Oh, I'm going to pin this kind of
I
guy.
couldn't pin a thing. No, didn't know what that meant back in the day. So not that I owned a war wagon, but just I remember even down to the Catacombs of Terror, where you had the throne, but
Yeah,
and that was solid metal pieces, and even that just didn't want to stay together because they were just flat panels of metal that are
yeah.
so heavy. No matter how much super glue you put on those guys,
Super glue and bad
yeah,
language.
they are not staying together. And I think the War Wagon is just a perfect example of that as well.
Yes, yes. Yes, that's it. That massive thing
Fantastic.
pulled by those 2 poor horses as well.
Yeah, yes. But yeah, I think a really fun sort of trip down memory lane, a very interesting insight into just where Games Workshop and Warhammer was in
Mhm.
1993 and how they were moving things forward, how they were pinning down the Warhammer world and the armies that were in it, and really sort of making it, this is a cohesive world now, and these are
Yeah,
the armies, and this is how you can collect them and how you can play them. And like you said, giving a sandbox so people could just do what they wanted in this sort of structured space is really, really good. I think it's a great example of an armies book. I wouldn't want to say it's because don't have the recollection to say it's the best of the armies books right now, but it feels like it will be a contender
yeah,
because it's just a really solid example of how to do this.
Yeah, I think it's one of those. What do you choose as the best? There's so much of this is down to an emotional attachment, depending on where you were in your life and what you were you getting into the game, or how much nostalgia is attached to the given army list. But if you try and step back and look at it objectively, even without the artwork, and just think of the content,
Mm.
it is very complete
Yeah. Yes.
in terms of its level of detail and the number of units and things. One of the most complete. Obviously, is missing a couple of units from later editions, but they haven't been invented at that point of the game. But aside from that, it is an incredibly complete and flexible. And so for that, for that alone, it's very, very good. Even if you prefer the visuals of 6th edition and 7th edition and so on.
Yeah. Yeah. It's great. Complete is a good way of sort of summarizing it, I think, because it gives you everything you need, whether that's to understand the story or to build an army or to paint an army even, because there's some really good stuff in terms of the painting guides and the heavy metal pages. And inspiration as well, just generally. There's
Yeah.
so much in here that's just great. So yeah, I think a big win, a big win. Hot off the presses, we've got a hot take for 1993's brand new Warhammer Armies book, The Empire, and we're saying it's good. Go out and buy it.
Yeah, don't need the new Arcane Journal
Use this. Turn up with
edition.
this. Fantastic. Well, Stu, where can people find you online if they want to hear more of your musings and various videos?
Miniature Realms YouTube channel primarily, but also across all of the social networks these days at the moment. And yeah, if you want to find out about what videos I'm posting, follow me on there. But yeah, YouTube is the way to go.
Fantastic. Yeah. And you can find me at Jordan Sorcery. And we're going to be taking a look at some other non-fiction titles from Warhammer history in future videos. We've got a few lined up. Similarly, we'll want to take a look at Armies books. We might take a look at the odd codex here and there. We might even look further afield at some of the other supplements and stuff that was produced. But we're also still doing our GW Books Club, where we're looking at the fiction of the old original fiction line. We've got 2 books left to go. One is the final Dark Future book, Ghost Dancers. That's coming up next. Then we've also got one final Warhammer fantasy story, which is Beasts in Velvet by Jack Yeovil. Very excited to be reading that one. And then later in the year, we're going to be sort of taking a look at some other fiction from Games Workshop's history. So the GW Books Club is going to evolve and change and iterate, much like the Empire has over its many editions. And we're going to take a look at some other awesome fiction from Games Workshop's history. So that's stuff to look out for in the future. But for now, thank you everybody for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.